X-31 came along just as the X-29 was winding down, and it had its roots in the Cold War. It was not driven by technology, it was driven by a real Cold War problem, and that problem was, what happens if the Soviets come across into the West with an overwhelming force? How do we beat them back? That concern, of course, was reflected throughout the U.S. and its allies, but really prominent in those countries that were on the border. The West Germans in particular. A prominent engineer, an aerospace engineer in Germany, Wolfgang Herbst, at Messerschmitt Bölkow-Blohm in the early 70s began looking at the problem and how you deal with it. And the Germans did a variety of studies, some and eventually wound up with simulations, both computer-based as well as man-in-the-dome kinds of simulations, to prove that if you had an aircraft that could point independent of the flight path, was highly agile, it could wind up with an exchange ratio to make the result more palatable than the one we would have with equal capabilities on both sides. And that formed the root of the X-31 program. The Germans, that company then got together with North American Aircraft, part of Rockwell International. They teamed up to present a proposal to DARPA in 1983 to go create an X-plane. The result of all that was the first, and to my knowledge, still only international X-plane. We had not just the two major countries participating, but 9 agencies and numerous companies, both prime and subcontractor, both in the United States and across Europe, across Western Europe at the time. So it was an interesting management challenge to do all this. The program set itself up with 4 major objectives. The first one is to prove that an aircraft could be built that possessed the agility required based on those simulations and those studies that could meet the requirements to go deal with that numerically superior force. The second major objective was to go prove it, to go assess the tactical value in a real combat kind of situation. This is with an X-plane. Those became the driving forces, 2 of the 4 requirements that never changed throughout the program, and all of which ultimately were met. We built 2 aircraft, both of them largely based in the United States, although the Germans had several key roles in the program. They built the all-composite wings, the first time that had been done, to my knowledge, in Germany. Made it in the U.S. when the wings were brought over. This is in the late 80s. They also had the task of creating an integrated flight control system that blended the aerodynamic surfaces with the thrust vectoring system. And they also had the task of designing and building the all-carbon composite thrust vectoring vanes that allow the aircraft to have the kind of maneuverability that it ultimately would attain. That agility that aircraft possessed was termed, and you'll find that in the literature, it's called super maneuverability at the time. The program, another unique facet of the program is it took a long time to unfold. Now there were reasons for that. The early part of the program, because it was international in nature, it took a long time to get agreements in place with all the other agencies you have to deal with when you do this kind of effort. And that itself took on the order, I want to say, about 4 or 5 years. The aircraft took about 3 to 4 years to build from the time the design began. Airplanes were produced and started flying. And then we went through 2 separate flight test programs. The first one was called the Enhanced Fighter Maneuverability Program. This is the one that was DARPA-led, the one I'll spend most of my time on in the remainder of my remarks. 6 years after that program ended in 1995, the Navy took the remaining airplane, and I'll explain what that means in a moment, and created the Vector program, which went on for about 5 years looking at certain aspects of the technology that they were interested in. Well, that was unfolding, of course, so 20 years is a long time. Lots is happening in the external environment. The major event that created issues for us was the fall of the Berlin Wall and ultimately the end of the Cold War, which occurred right at the beginning of the flight test program. And when I say it created problems, the big one being the lack of finances for DoD organizations and the Defense Department in general, given the winding down that took place after the first Iraq War under Clinton. So finding money was difficult. It forced us to be very innovative and very frugal in the way we conducted the flight test effort. The second major set of events that took place was the change in air combat itself. While the requirements for this program had their roots in Vietnam and all those 1960s, 1970s engagements that we fought within visual range, that was, by the way, a requirement to engage an adversary during the Vietnam Wars. You had to see them. The tendency with the advent of stealth and low observability was to take the fight beyond visual range, use long-range missiles and their stealth to keep you from being seen, and the whole nature of their combat was set to change. So we went from one very different set of circumstances where the technologies that we were offering in the X-31 program were in vogue to one where everybody said, well, we don't want to go there again, even though most pilots assumed that if you got within a many-on-many combat exchange, you would ultimately wind up within visual range and have to be able to do some of this sort of maneuvering. In the flight test program, one of the first things we did because of that funding shortage was find a way to accelerate the envelope expansion. Given this airplane's abilities to fly up to 70 degrees angle attack routinely, it was pushed to 90 on a number of occasions. To point independently of its flight path, you can imagine the number of parameters you'd have to measure to do a standard flight test envelope expansion. My calculations at the time said it would take on the order of anywhere from 4 to 12 years, depending on what assumptions you made. I had 2 years worth of money left at that point. So we convened a meeting in Antelope Valley at one of the hotels for 3 days, sat down and tried to figure out a way to do this in a much more rapid way, and came up with this concept of maneuver milestones. The group defined 4, and I'll show them to you shortly in a video, that sort of captured the personality of the maneuverability of this aircraft. Following that, and by the way, we did that, we planned to do that in 18 months, we wound up actually executing it in 6. So the team proved up to the task in terms of accelerating the envelope expansion portion of the effort. We then went into close-in combat, first with the F-18s that NASA had as chase planes. We thought this would make an adequate adversary. We created, using wingtip tanks, inertial matching to the X-31, the difference being the F-18s didn't have the thrust vectoring. And we flew a number of engagements, close to 80 as a matter of fact, with those airplanes. The problem, of course, we had was the results came out way too positive. We didn't believe what we were seeing. We thought maybe it was test pilots flying and those airplanes that were part of the issue. So we started engaging active combat squadrons, F-14s, F-15s, F-16s, F-18s from the fleet. And the results, when we went up against aircraft that were similarly equipped, had similar performance parameters, thrust to weight, other things, the results came out the same. So we were very successful in demonstrating the effectiveness of using post-fall maneuvering in a kind of engagement where you're up against a numerically superior adversary. Because of the other changes that occurred during that period of time, we thought we had to prove to our customer base, the services, that the same technologies that we were using for this cosmic maneuverability had application elsewhere. So we did a number of demonstrations to prove that the same technology could allow you to fly at supersonic speeds without a tail. The thrust vectoring simply did what Newton said you have to do with forces, providing the restoring forces and moments. And we were able to showcase that on the other end of the envelope. We also introduced the first helmet-mounted displays to within visual range combat aircraft, and we also developed a concept called ESTOL, extremely short takeoff or landing, dramatically reducing runway lengths on launch and recovery that the Navy was interested in fact, formed the basis for starting that second program called Vector out there in the 1998. I mentioned that they used one aircraft. It turns out the last thing we did in the EFM program, we had planned, and we did go to the 1995 Paris Air Show. We're the first, and to my knowledge, only X-plane to perform in front of the public. We did it there. But 4 months prior to that, one of our 2 airplanes augured in the desert, the first major accident they had at Edwards Air Force Base. And I mention this because only DARPA, with their perspective on risk, would allow a program manager to take the remaining X-plane and go after the Paris opportunity. Gary Denman, then director of DARPA, gets the credit for that decision, and we were able to fly every day but one at Paris that year. So let me give you a quick snapshot with a short video. In fact, let's start it. I'll try to narrate as we go. So the first thing you're going to see are the 4 maneuver milestones. The first, sustained flight at 70 degrees angle of attack. These are all aerodynamic and aeronautical firsts for an X-plane. This is a velocity vector roll of planes at 70 degrees angle of attack. We did them in 360-degree rolls in both directions, eventually at very high rate. This is the first time we did a rapid pitch-up successfully into the post-stall condition. And you take those maneuvers and put them together. We did this maneuver called a Herbst maneuver. It's the airplane equivalent of a swimmer doing a flip turn in a swimming pool. It's a high-speed entry one way, 180-degree turn the other way using the high angle of attack to precess around the velocity, the flight path, and then heading out the other way in the opposite direction. This is the pilot simply showing you how he can point that airplane no matter which direction it happens to be heading. We did a number of these things before we engaged in this kind of air combat. This is one of the vignettes, it's a short one, where the F-18 and the X-31 are shown with animation based on real flight test data. And up in the upper right, you're looking out through the HUD camera on the X-31. You can see the F-18 come into sight and how the virtual gun is tracked on him for a short period of time to get the kill. And this is the kind of engagement we ran with neutral starts, head-on starts, and also negative starts. This is the Paris routine. The 4 maneuvers we did every day in Paris, as I said, but the first one is a takeoff to a vertical climb followed by what's called a post-stall loop, which you'll see shortly. Coming right here, instead of going over the top the normal way, he pulls it through post-stall to 70 degrees angle of attack and then begins a heading reversal. And of course, when the public saw this happen at the air show, it's like an E.F. Hutton moment. This is the aircraft doing we call it the mongoose maneuver, our answer to the Cobra. It's a skidding turn with the airplane winding up at 70 degrees angle of attack. Sustained flight, 40 knots, going away from the crowd so the airplane looks like it's just hanging in the air. We wanted to do a square dance around the runway with this technology. They wouldn't let us come back toward the crowd, so we decided to do 2 90-degree turns. This is the first time it was attempted. The guy who's flying the airplane right now is Chief Test Pilot Fred Knox. I say Chief Test Pilot, he was for Boeing before he retired. And the first time he did it, he didn't get 2 90-degree turns, he got a 180, but it's nonetheless the first time it was attempted. And then the last maneuver is a high-speed entry, almost sonic speed, heading up to 5,000 feet, showing you the airplane's pretty quick as well. And then another post-stall loop followed by a double heading reversal, assuring you that this is nothing about inertia. This airplane is fully controllable in virtually every stage of the period. It'll come away right here. So since my time is up.
Well done.